Hi, and welcome to our third section of Module 5, named Timing of Entry. We talked about entry a little bit when we discussed technology adoption curves or S-curves, when we had a conversation about dominant designs. Here we want to take a firm level perspective, and namely we want to think about what is our window of opportunity for entry. Right, and so in this graphic, this graphic provides kind of a broad, really simplified overview. We'll go in more detail in a bit, but the idea is, right, we have a certain number of categories, right, of the technology or of those products. Then we have a certain number of firms offering it. It can be dangerous to be on the very early point of that curve, right? Because if consumers are not very familiar with what we're offering, and they're not quite used to it, then we might kind of we might be too early, right? And so we want to find kind of a compromise between how many competitors we have and how many categories, how many versions and options, design options are existing. Now, when we think a bit about a typical example here is social networks, right? Most of you will probably know that Facebook was not the first social network. Typically, it's associated with MySpace. Then there is others like Friendster, and we've seen Twitter, Google+, TikTok, et cetera, in these kind of adoption or the kind of usage statistics. You've seen, interestingly here, TikTok has quite a rapid rise, and these are 2018 numbers. We've seen these become even stronger in the last couple of years. And you also see a few of these social media companies kind of flatten out. Specifically, Reddit has seen a slower adoption, right? Has seen strong adoption over the last couple of years, but started out relatively slow. And you can't see. So MySpace here is somewhere here to find, has essentially fizzled out as a social media platform. And you can see it really never quite got the reach and the impact that Facebook has. And so the idea, right, if I have to think about my timing of entry, right, what are the opportunities, what are the conditions, how are my core capabilities, what is my technology essentially offering, will I be able to get enough installed base, will I be able to have a strong technological advantage that I can offer, et cetera, et cetera. We think about customers, right? So here the previous two statistics were about kind of the general usage numbers of these different social media platforms. Here is a question about what kind of broad customer segments am I targeting, right? We know that certain social media platforms are more targeted towards a certain type of customers, and again, this has typically people separate by demographics, because different demographics have kind of homogeneous characteristics, or so they think. In reality, the reality is that there's all sorts of categories within Gen Z, millennials, Gen X, and baby boomers that you have to consider, right? And that makes actually a lot more sense to create your own customer segments based on how you're going to target them and what kind of preferences and characteristics they have, rather than take these pre-defined demographic characteristics that are not always as helpful as people think. Again, looking at TikTok, right, that's been on the news for quite a bit, or Snapchat and Instagram, we've seen quite a significant rise of these platforms. Certainly TikTok has shown some incredible growth perspectives, and most of these are expected, except for Instagram, are expecting to kind of flatten out a little bit in 2024 and 25. But again, these are these are kind of expectations or kind of assumptions. We'll see how these things go. In the end, we look at, for example, also statistics like when do you reach a certain number of users, right? We always kind of like to think in these technology S-curves. And in this particular case, what we see is that from the launch of these apps to a certain standardized number of years, how long did they take them to reach 1 billion users? And we see TikTok has effectively done it in half the time that Instagram did. Again, whether this is a meaningful statistic or not, this is just showing kind of the growth that some of these technologies and innovations can take compared to others. Again, this is kind of an example. We took the social media because there's a lot of really interesting data there. It's something called 60degrees.com. I am actually not familiar with it. I was doing some research before preparing this presentation, but it's quite interesting, right? And so 60degrees.com, like a lot of these social media websites or social media platforms, are in need of figuring out this kind of two-sided platform dynamic, right? Do I have enough consumers or users for this platform? And can I offer that then to advertisers and companies, et cetera, to be on it, right? So there needs to be a certain number of, a certain size threshold needs to be reached in order for it to be relevant, especially if you want to target advertisements, et cetera, et cetera. Again, what we've seen is that this area becomes increasingly relevant and important as the internet kind of moves forward, with eventually having Facebook and some other social media sites becoming kind of the dominant players. And only a few, including Instagram that was bought by Facebook, Snapchat and TikTok, kind of being late in the game or later in the game than these more dominant ones. So it's really, the purpose here is not so much to find, you know, the perfect formula of when you should time or when you should enter into a market, but just to kind of give you kind of an idea of some considerations that firms or entrants should think about. Clearly, it is an important question when I enter a market. And the question of then how do I define it and what are if those conditions are good or bad or sufficient, you'll need to do more research. There is a couple of advantages and disadvantages being a first, second, or late mover. We'll see, we'll do an overview in our last slide here, but the question here is, do you want to be a pioneer? Do you want to be an early follower, late entrant, etc.? And these are a couple of questions. Can think a little bit about that. Right? Generally speaking, what are some first mover advantages? Well, a first mover or early mover, let's say, you can develop some technological leadership and build a follower, build some brand loyalty around your technology and your innovation. You can access or develop or secure resources preemptively that then later on will be harder for your competitors to access, right? We talked about the types of resources that give you sustainable competitive advantage. You can, once you develop kind of a customer affinity to your products and technologies, it's actually kind of hard for consumers to switch once they're used to your platform, right? Consumer switching costs, depending, of course, on the kind of technology that you offer, are relatively high, right? Leaving Facebook, even though a lot of people announce that, is harder than you think. If most of your friends are on Facebook, you get most of the news from Facebook, you participate in a lot of groups on Facebook, it becomes really hard to leave, right? And so the more interactions you create with those users and customers, And the earlier, therefore, you go on the market and create that, right, before other people recognize that potential, the more advantage you can build over time. Now, on the disadvantage end, of course, if you're one of the early movers, you typically have to spend a lot of money and effort on research and development, right? So it's you can't really build on an infrastructure typically, right? You have to build that infrastructure. I mean, think about Amazon building their platform and supply chain infrastructure early on, which is why they started with books, right? Among the many reasons is they had to start in a category where their technology and competitive advantages are optimal, right? They had no problem competing with bookstores. Their problem was competing with Walmart, right? That's why they didn't want to, they want to start doing that. And so they kind of slowly built that capability. Once they had their technology platform in place, once they saw that the business model works, they can then go to the next level of their product and platform and compete accordingly. Again, right? So these are all things like undeveloped supply chain and distribution channels, enabling technologies and complements, right? So it's again not enough that you have a core technology that you bring to the market, but what are some of the complementary goods or complementary technologies? We talked about that early on in technological value. And how do you build these, right? So how do you have access to those? And if you're too early, it might take a while until the market catches up with you, and that might be too late because you don't have enough customers, and means you eventually run out of. So these are some factors that influence optimal timing of entry. So how certain are customer preferences? If customer needs are well understood, it is more feasible to enter the market earlier, right? The more you have to experiment with customer preferences, the harder it is to make an entry decision, right? Because more experimentation means more time, means more money, also means that their competitors might adjust to that pretty quickly. How much improvement does the innovation provide over previous solutions? Again, we talked about that in technological value. You really have to significantly provide a significant advantage of some sort, right? And a good example, so if we think about Netflix, that initially didn't provide really a new technology, right? Streaming came a little later. One of their targeting strategies was DVD customers, because DVD was a relatively new medium at the time. The DVD manufacturers were interested in partnering with somebody who can promote their new devices. And for Blockbuster, it would have cost a lot of money to switch from VHS to DVD. And at that point, they didn't consider Netflix a competitor yet. And so that's a way for you to think about how much does my innovation, in this case, it's more of a business model and service innovation than a technological one. But how big of an advantage does the innovation generate? Again, does the innovation require enabling technologies, and are these technologies sufficiently mature, right? So complementary goods, you can have a very technologically advanced system or product. If you don't have complementary goods, you're going to have a problem pretty quickly, right? Because you just don't get the installed base if people see no benefit or coordination with other products and services. And again, this is one of the big success factors for Apple's ecosystem, is to have these components in there to launch. Do complementary goods influence the value of the innovation, and are they sufficiently available? Yeah, we talked about that briefly. Again, this point is related to enabling technologies. Okay, it's not exactly the same. So complementary goods do not have to be enabling technologies, but think about Amazon without the internet, right? That's going to be a little difficult. So it would have had to run essentially through a catalog. But again, the internet enabling these kind of businesses, that was a critical part for them kind of entering the market. How high is the threat of competitive entry? Again, there are barriers to entry, right? We talked about that in the Porter's 5 Forces framework. There, the question is like, how easy is it for other competitors small or large, to enter that market, right? And if the barriers to entry are pretty low, well, that could be a problem for you, right? So you have to figure out, how do you actually create barriers to entry? And the closer you're to a customer and the higher the switching costs for your customers, that creates essentially a barrier to entry for your competitors. Are there increasing returns to adoption? If so, allowing competitors to get a head start can be very risky, right? And so think about the car market, right? What we've seen there is essentially Ford starting to dominate kind of the mass production, and then other companies be quickly following up, worrying that they'll risk their market if they don't enter and if they don't compete with some of these manufacturing, these kind of economies of scale. Do you have enough cash at hand, right? So every time you introduce a new and radical or disruptive technology, you will have to do a lot of debugging, right? And you've seen this in software. You can imagine seeing it in hardware. The higher the complexity, the more cash you have at hand to be able to develop a functioning technology system for your prospective customers, right? Does the firm have enough resources to accelerate market acceptance? Related factor, right? But this is more related, this is less related to R&D, but more to marketing and promotional techniques. Remember, Cree Incorporated talked about that, right? They, instead of spending hundreds of millions in newspaper ads and TV ads, they used social media and a very clear marketing strategy to lower those costs, but also get a better connection to customers. Is the firm's reputation likely to reduce the uncertainty of customers, suppliers, and distributors? Well, and that's a good question, right? So if not only do I have a dominant design, but I also compete against firms with good reputations, great customer service, generally factors that cost me a lot of money and are really not as easy to replicate initially, I have to really reconsider, right? What kind of market I am entering. Again, the more disruptive your technology is, the more likely consumers are willing to take a risk about it, right? And you typically target, we talked about early adopters, kind of the fans, technology fans. Think about Tesla, right? They started with a Roadster. That was their entry point into the car market. And of course, being an electric vehicle manufacturer, at that time weren't a lot of competing products, except maybe for the Prius hybrid, in that sense. So it's important to figure out your entry point. It's important to figure out your niche, and important is to whether that niche will consider the value of your innovation and technology so much higher than what's currently available in the market. Okay, so if we think about that, okay, we do like an overview. We realize that there is quite a lot of interesting historical evidence for some of these. You can imagine, so 8mm video camera, I'm not super familiar with that market, but I do know Sony became very dominant in space. I mean, I had a Sony camera, tons of my friends had, and Kodak, one of the companies who was initially the first mover, couldn't fully capitalize on that. And there's all kinds of stories, all kinds of examples of both advantages and disadvantages of being the first mover. You've seen IBM being a really early mover. I mean, one of the early firms that sold computers. Over time, they kind of lost this advantage. But what we've seen over time is that Apple and IBM kind of focusing on different segments. Both, by the way, IBM also a pioneer in smartphones. So this is a smartphone example, but you can also think about the personal computer. IBM, well, MITS kind of the really first mover, but IBM, Apple, and other other providers kind of catching up. Again, don't take this as kind of gospel. The idea is that over time, companies have to adjust to the marketplace, right? And first movers don't always do that the best. Sometimes they're very good at that. Sometimes they're not as good, right? Depending on whether, you know, their core capabilities become core rigidities. We talked about this in earlier parts of this module. And among other factors, right? Do they invest in the right technologies? Are they close enough to the customers? What are some things in the marketplace that change that kind of affect how these companies operate in these markets? And again, we'll find a lot of examples of these, both kind of the winners, right? And winners here being relative. But yeah, so this kind of comparison gives you a broad overview. Again, this is more of a general kind of a summary, so to speak, putting together all these different factors that we talked about in the previous modules, and understanding that, yeah, okay, I have to do my research, right? I have to understand, how does the marketplace look like? How do my competitors operate? Who are my customers? That helps me kind of assess more strategically where I'm going to enter the market, right? Not only when, but also where. And so, yeah, so that gives you a brief overview and also concludes the last section of this module.